bit, but good afternoon, and thanks everybody for joining us today to learn more about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We've got a great panel with some of Nashville's best experts in the area of mobility and transit. This event is being hosted by the Transit Alliance of Middle Tennessee and Moving Forward. My name is Todd Rolap. I'm the managing partner at Bassberry & Sims and also serve as the chair for Moving Forward. Moving Forward is dedicated to creating regional transportation solutions that work for Middle Tennesseans. We're an organization of volunteers that brings together the community by empowering business and transit thought leaders to engage with the critical transportation issues that face Middle Tennessee. We all know, of course, critical transit and mobility options are how critical they are to the quality of life for Middle Tennesseans, ensuring that our residents have access to jobs, education, and amenities. I think we all believe that when we invest in transit and all Middle Tennesseans can have access to affordable, convenient, dependable transit, we will all benefit. And this calls for greater funding for transit with a commitment to equitable investment. Today, we're here to learn more about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, what it means for transportation projects across Middle Tennessee, and what it could mean for transit throughout the region. This funding is important and has the potential to be impactful to the regional transportation system overall, and it's vital that we understand its implications and limitations. Today, we're extremely fortunate to have a great local panel talking to us about the potential impacts of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Michael Skipper is here. He's the Executive Director of Greater Nashville Regional Council. Michael has more than 20 years of experience in public policy, community and regional planning, and social research. He currently serves as the Executive Director of the Greater Nashville Regional Council, which serves the planning and community development needs of the region. In addition to his GNRC responsibilities, Michael serves as the lead facilitator and advisor to the 10-county Middle Tennessee Mayor's Caucus, which provides leadership on important issues facing a rapidly changing region. Sounds like someone may need to mute their, hit the mute button in their Zoom app. We also have Steve Bland here. Steve is the CEO of WeGo Public Transit. Steve is the CEO also for the Regional Transport Authority of Middle Tennessee. He began his tenure in Nashville in August of 2014. He's a lifetime transit manager with over 25 years in the industry and has served in the chief executive role for the transit agencies in York, Pennsylvania, Albany, New York, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He currently serves on the board of directors for the Tennessee Public Transportation Association, chairing its legislative committee. And our event will be moderated today by Jessica Dauphin, the president and CEO of the Transit Alliance of Middle Tennessee, an organization that works with contributors, community officials, and regional leaders to build support for funding regional transit in Middle Tennessee. Jessica and the Alliance do a great job educating us on these issues and helping to work towards policy that will serve our entire region. And I believe Jessica was recently appointed to the Nashville MTA Board of Directors. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica. We will be taking questions throughout the discussion, so please place your questions in the chat feature for our speakers. Jessica, take it away, and thank you for doing this.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Todd. That was a great welcome and pre-set up to our conversation today. Again, my name is Jessica Dauphin, the president and CEO of the Transit Alliance. I want to give a little background on myself. Yes, I am humbled and honored to serve as a member of the MTA board and work with Steve and the team there. They do a great job at serving Nashville's immediate transit needs, public transit needs. I was born in Nashville and raised in Cheatham County. My people are from Dixon, Williamson, Columbia, Murray, and West Nashville. I like to point out the fact that my dad rode a public bus to Hume-Fogg High School in the 60s. So I have an incredible deep stake in this conversation and the smarter, more developed thoughtfully developing growth of Nashville, I really believe that transportation and mobility is how we are going to define who we are as a region for generations. And I'm just tickled that I get to be part of this conversation in this role on this issue. With that said, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is why we're here today. It is a $1.2 trillion massive investment plan that was passed late last year with bipartisan support. It includes many big ticket items that made headlines and sparked hope for big improvements to the country's infrastructure. It includes things like cybersecurity, broadband, water, roads, and transit. Today, we're talking primarily about transportation, which includes transit. You know, after that, there's this big sigh of relief, right? America finally has a generation-defining infrastructure bill and can begin a building spree larger than what happened in the New Deal, or so says Brookings Institute. So we can all go home and call it a day, right? Not really. Now the action shifts. Federal agencies like the Departments of Transportation and Energy have the enormous responsibility to implement the law, stand up new programs, and get money into hands of state and local officials who carry an even greater burden. And that's where we are today. This is where the proverbial rubber meets the road. See what I did there? State and local officials are the owners and operators of most infrastructure and must design and build new assets, hire more workers, and even mobilize their own financial resources. So as you can see, this bill is way more than meets the eye. So luckily we have two very studied local experts to help contextualize this and bring this home for us so we can internalize and understand more about what it is. Okay, Michael, I want to start with you, all right? I have had a number of conversations with folks locally who assume that this is more free money, like the CARES Act or American Rescue Plan. Could you, but as I understand it, it's more of a reauthorization of traditional spending. Like we always pretty much spend this kind of money, but could you help us out by explaining what the IIJA really is?
Yeah, let me start out by, one, I think we should applaud the nation and Congress and the administration for the bill that became the law, which will fund transportation and other infrastructure over the next 5 years. It's often the case, we fund transportation through these congressional acts, which authorizes the programming in about 5-year chunks, and often at the end of the 5 years that the former bill had authorized, we end up waiting around another 2, 3, 4, 5 years for reauthorization of our infrastructure spending, namely transportation, in terms of what we're talking about today. So one of the things to be, if on the bright side, to be pleased about with this specific act is that it didn't, it was a really quick follow-up to the FAST Act, which authorized transportation funding when it was enacted back in 2015. So that's good news, is that we're not waiting around, sort of waiting to see how the Congress is going to address our transportation needs. I think though, to be realistic, and you just hinted at it, I think the headline is a little bit different than the Brookings quote that you provided. This is not the massive spending bill that will provide generational level investments into our transportation infrastructure that we were all hoping to see. There is another piece of legislation that it looks like it stalled out in Congress, called the Build Back Better Act, which was really more of the big stimulus that we're all wanting for infrastructure. This is, as you mentioned, really a reauthorization of traditional pots of money for the next 5 years with an infusion of some additional stimulus. So there is a supplemental effect of this act. And specifically, when you look at the $1.2 trillion budget of this 5-year act, we're seeing just under 600 million of that going dedicated to transportation. Of the 567 billion, I should say 600 billion. So 567.5 $565.5 billion of the $1.2 trillion is dedicated to transportation infrastructure. Of that amount, $293.5 billion is basically the 5 years of continuation of previous spending, and about $274 billion of new investment over the 5-year period of time. And just to translate that for you, put that into context within across the state of Tennessee, that's about $1 billion more per year from federal sources for transportation projects from this act. To put that $1 billion into context, we get about $1 billion per year already from the feds. So about $1 billion to the state of Tennessee that gets combined with the state gas tax revenue and some other additional revenue that's generated by the state for transportation projects, which is about $1 billion, a little over $1 billion itself. About $1 billion a year from federal sources. This is adding another $1 billion over a 5-year period. So it's not as transformative in terms of additional funding as one may have thought reading the headlines of this bill being passed. But it is a good shot in the arm. It really reinforces the traditional funding mechanisms. I don't know, like in terms of the formulaic distribution of this funding, that it opens up opportunities to do a lot of new things that we weren't already planning to do. But what it will do, at least on the highway side, and I'll let Steve speak more to the transit side, it will allow us to make sure projects don't fall further behind schedule because they're waiting on funding. Because the situation we're in now, and we'll probably unpack this a little bit later on, is that while projects are waiting to have a sufficient amount of funding to move forward, inflation is happening in the background. So project costs keep increasing, and not just the inflation in terms of building projects, but right of way is going up as well as your property values are going up. And so project costs keep increasing before we can actually get the full amount of money available to do those projects. And so we're constantly chasing these projects. And so I think the shot in the arm is really going to help us get to those projects a little bit sooner than we had hoped, and hopefully stabilize some of the cost estimates that we're seeing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was a really good primer. So what I hear is that it's not necessarily new spending. They've just added buckets and augmented the funding buckets that they already were funding for infrastructure.
Yeah, well, there's some new spending there, but I think we got to be realistic that it's not the trillions of dollars going to infrastructure above and beyond what we normally do that we all thought might be the case coming out of Congress about a year ago.
Excellent. But Tennessee overall is slated to get about $1 billion more per year. So that brings total funding for roadway and transportation up to $2 billion. No,
it'd be $1 billion over 5 years.
Over 5 years. Okay. Yeah. Very
so
important.
We're getting what we normally get per year additional from this bill spread out over 5 years.
Got it. So this not only goes for roads and bridges, but it also affects transit. I want to hear from Steve now. First, Steve, what does it mean, this IIJA, what does it mean for transit funding and spending in Middle Tennessee?
Sure. Well, first of all, good afternoon, boss, Jessica, and thanks for having me. And I would dovetail on Michael's comments. From a mass transit perspective, there's definitely an infusion of new money. The pro and the con, and I would absolutely echo his comment that one of the biggest advantages to come out of the bill is predictability. We're not there kind of worrying, what's going to happen in this Congress or next Congress. We now have a framework that we know will work within over the next 5 or 6 years, maybe more, depending on how Congress is down the road act. In terms of the infusions of money, there is a significant increase in the funding authorization for transit over the life of the bill. In total, in all of the programs, about 70%, which is significant. Where we would tap into it really are two primary areas, one for sure and one potentially, depending on if we play our cards right. One is our traditional formula programs, which sort of automatically generate to urbanized areas. And the largest of those is our urbanized area formula program. And depending on how that funding gets distributed, and we should actually start to see how that works over the next month or two when the federal government issues their apportionment notices, we could actually see anywhere from probably $10 to $13 million annually to the Nashville metropolitan area. But again, to put that in perspective, in the perspective that Michael kind of laid out, Overall, right now, on an annual basis, if you combine all of our regional operators, Metro Transit Authority, Regional Transportation Authority, Murfreesboro Rover, Franklin Transit, Clarksville Transit, we're probably spending an order of magnitude about $120 to $140 million a year on public transportation now. So it definitely will be a boost, certainly in terms of stabilizing state of good repair, allowing us to plan a little bit further, gives us a little bit more wiggle room as we work with Michael and the Metropolitan Planning Organization doing transportation improvement plans. But on the formula side, it's kind of a stability exercise. The other opportunity is there is significant additions to what's called in the Federal Transit Administration, the Capital Investment Grant Program. And those are sort of those big dollar project items really falling into two major categories that have an impact or a potential impact on Nashville. One is the New Starts program, which is a very large capital program, typically for rail investment. And the other is the Small Starts program, which is focused more on things like bus rapid transit. But in order to be competitive, even looking at the numbers, even with the infusion of new money into those programs, with all the projects that are currently in the pipeline, it is still an oversubscribed program. So if we want to be successful in competing for those dollars, we're really going to have to double down on our game to develop local plans, regional plans that are viable and that show very strong and firm local commitment, including the commitment of local funding. And then the other thing I've pointed out to a couple folks is, you know, the immediate impact of the additional funding on the transit side is we will actually need more local money. The program that was adopted in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for public transportation largely follows the existing program structure. So match ratios, planning requirements, environmental requirements, the actual structure of the program is largely the same as what we had under the FAST Act. So those are some of the short-term implications we're looking at.
Okay. I heard a few things in there, but I want to revisit Michael. You said that it would impact our regional roadways and bridges and projects, but not in some really significant way. But could you tell us a little bit more about how it could impact those projects? And as Steve was saying, that the FTA money tends to be highly competitive, are the roadway funds similar to that?
Yeah, there's a big parallel between what's happening on the Federal Transit Administration side of this money and with the Federal Highway Administration side of this money. And you know, we talk about the money coming through these modal administrations of the DOT, but the other thing that these bills allow us to do is use flexibility. And so something might be coming, a grant might be coming to us from the Federal Highway Administration. Doesn't mean we have to spend it on a roadway widening. We can, you know, flex it over to Steve to buy vehicles or implement transit service. And so, you know, but in terms of the grant programs, they do mirror each other fairly well in terms of matching requirements. But I will go back to something Steve mentioned, because I think this is really important for those of you who want to understand how the funding works so that you can have an influence on what gets funded. But a good amount of this money is going to be distributed to states and regions by way of formula. And each grant program that is distributed by formula may have a somewhat different set of parameters that go into that formula distribution, but it's otherwise sort of guaranteed to be distributed out to states and regions to be used at their discretion on the projects that they consider their priorities that meet the eligibility requirements of those grants. Those tend to be competitive within the state or regional context. And so that's one of our roles, is to basically host those competitions amongst the transit agencies and the local governments who want to compete for the formula funds to fund projects that are happening within their local communities.
Michael, when you say our role, who do you mean?
GNRC, and so the Greater Nashville Regional Council has a transportation policy board that is made up of city and county mayors and transportation officials that represent the entities across about 7 counties here in Middle Tennessee. They have ultimately the authority to program all the federal funds that we're talking about. So whether it's a project selected with formula funds or a project that is going after a national competition, that policy board is going to endorse those projects and ultimately program them so that they can actually be used at the local level. So you have the formulaic money that is coming to the state and the region. We play a huge role as a staff in facilitating how we're going to use those funds that are under our discretion as a locality. And then you've got the competitive funds, the discretionary funds that Steve mentioned, which is really, I'd say, more of an opportunity with this infrastructure bill than the formulaic, because the formulaic is really, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, it's really going to go to feed that pipeline of projects that were largely determined 5, 10, 15, in some cases 20 years ago. It's really that discretionary money and the fusion of capital into those pots of money that I think is our opportunity here, where we get new ideas, vetted, analyzed. We understand their benefits, their costs, and then we submit those project ideas up to DC and hope that they get funded through these discretionary pots of money. And that is really additive. And our region hasn't historically tapped into these national competitive pots of money, the discretionary money, at the same rate as our peer regions. A lot of that is because these competitive programs require local skin in the game. And most of the folks online know that we've been fairly minimal in terms of our investments locally in the transportation infrastructure, typically providing the match for a lot of these capital projects and not much more than that, compared with peer regions. It's not a judgment on our region, only in the context of comparing ourselves to our peer regions. And so I think it's the same way on the highway side. There's an infusion of capital into 2 big competitive programs at the national level. The RAISE program is really interested. It's sort of the federal government's interest in funding access to opportunity, economic prosperity, good opportunity for multimodal projects that really address quality of life issues. And then there's an infra grant program at the federal level that's discretionary. And that's a program that's aimed at funding infrastructure that's going to support more of that freight highway intermodal element that will support our economy as well. So those are programs that we need to be thinking about. But to be competitive for those programs, we've got to do the planning, we've got to get the projects vetted, we've got to make a good case that they're worth the limited dollars that are in these discretionary pots at the federal level. And that's why, people get sort of fatigued with all the studies and the planning efforts, but those are really important efforts to generate the applications for the competitive money that that Steve began talking about a few minutes ago.
That's a great point. The study fatigue and the plan fatigue. Folks just kind of tuning out. Oh, another community engagement plan for a plan that we're looking at. But those are so critical to getting those funds and getting those projects started and off the ground or on the ground, really. There's a question that's come in. How are the fund allocations chosen? How do you choose if low-income neighbors or major highways get repairs? Is there a scale of importance or immediate need? How do you weight those, Michael?
Well, to some extent, some of these categories here may have dedicated pots of money at the federal level already, and that's and we're happy to share. It's probably too boring for me to go through all the new programs that were funded through this act. Some of this not super sizable amounts of money, but definitely a nod towards addressing some of these issues specifically, where the Congress is like, we need to address this specific problem, so we're going to put an amount of money to that and make it dedicated to that issue. So there are some new programs that this act created that will ensure that a certain minimum amount of investment is going to addressing some of these issues. And it's probably easier just to share that list. In terms of the formulaic money that we've been talking about, the formula distributed money that we have discretion over, this is this question is one that we're answering every 5 years when we update our regional transportation plan. And I need to make sure that I give everybody the proper way to access the regional transportation plan, because while I appreciate being part of the discussion and these conversations are really important, I think, a lot of times people feel disconnected from the details, like what are we actually funding in Middle Tennessee? What's in the pipeline? What's coming down the road? That is actually very accessible from our website. And so, Jessica, don't let me forget to give everybody those URLs, but every 5 years we present to our Transportation Policy Board that I mentioned earlier, a draft 25-year plan that accounts for all the federal funds we expect to have over that same time frame, with a corresponding set of projects that would be our priorities to fund with that money if it comes to fruition. That last plan was adopted in February of 2021. But during the development of that plan, that is one of the earliest steps that we take as a region, is to have conversation with our policymakers. That's informed by our public involvement process, where we basically weight how we go about prioritizing projects. We look at, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to, increase access to economic opportunity? Are we trying to manage congestion? Are we trying to improve safety? Are we trying to get better flow of freight across our roadway network? We're trying to do all those things. And so ultimately we have to decide which one of those things may be the most important, so that we have a sense of priority when it comes to positioning projects for funding. And so that's part of what the Regional Transportation Plan represents, is the goals that we're trying to achieve and their relative priority to each other, so that as we evaluate projects for investment, we can say this project is going to achieve this goal better than this other project, and then that would position that project better off for some of the formula funding that comes our way. So that's a really good question, and it's a question that we answer as a region every 5 years.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate that it is a regional question that the GNRC asks and looks at those priorities regionally. But for instance, if you're in Wilson County, your projects are going to be in the GNRC's Regional Transportation Plan. At least chances are high that they're going to be in there, right?
Yeah, that's right. Especially if the project is going to be implemented with any sort of federal funding, it'll certainly be in that plan.
So you want to check out, I put that link in the chat, solvethistogether.org. That's a really easy way to get there, but also gnrc.org you can get there on that website also. You can also find out more information about their Transportation Policy Board, which meets and discusses these types of issues too. Right, that's where these projects are discussed and regularly. There was another question from Robert. Do we expect the new act to change focus of funding toward A, improving pedestrian and cyclist safety, B, climate change mitigation, C, climate change avoidance, or D, integrating transport and land use planning to achieve any of the above? Who wants to take that one?
Why don't I give it a start from the transit side, Jessica, and then I know Michael will have a lot to add. First of all, in the transit programs, I think one important distinction folks need to understand is federal funding through this act, through this bill, is really only available for capital investments on the transit side. So we're not allowed to use these funds to operate transit service. So, when I say, well, we may get an additional $11 to $13 million a year, the thought that we could do a radical expansion of service kind of comes off the table because they're not eligible to be used for that. So that's an important context piece. And then from our standpoint, RTA, MTA, transit providers, one of our most important obligations that we have to document in our investment plans, both through GNRC and in our long-range transportation plans and to the Federal Transit Administration, is sustaining the current transit system in a state of good repair. So before we can contemplate doing new facilities or fleet expansion, we have to be able to document that we can maintain the existing infrastructure. Coming to Robert's question on sustainability and climate change, one of the significant discretionary programs in the act that, as Michael was alluding to, is what's referred to, there are really two, they're sort of related. It's a bus and bus facilities competitive grant program, and also what's specifically referred to in our industry as the low-no program, which is a specific program funding zero or very low emissions vehicles. But even within the bus and bus facilities competitive program, which we've been able to successfully compete for funding under in recent years, there's definitely every expectation that the focus for funding there will be on zero or low emissions vehicles. So, you know, that's certainly one area of investment moving into the future that we would see, you know, that type of priority on.
Okay, excellent. That answers one of those questions. Michael, what about, and I don't know enough about the IIJA to talk about if it's really focused on improving sidewalks and cyclist safety. Do you know?
Yeah, I think that's an increasing priority across the nation, you know, and there's going to be, you know, you've got the language in the act itself. You'll have a lot of guidance that will then ultimately come from the modal administrations we mentioned earlier, federal highway and federal transit. And I can guarantee you that they'll be translating this act into guidance that, if not requires through certain grant programs to address these issues, strongly encourages that as we're making our own decisions about how to spend the formula funds, that we're doing so in a way that's improving roadway safety and access to jobs from low-income households across the region. And, you know, that's going back to the role that GNRC plays. Our planners and our data team spend a lot of their time looking at these challenges across our region, both as they exist today, but also as we project them out into the future. And then studying every single one of these project ideas that are submitted by a local government or TDOT or Steve and the WeGo group to understand how that investment is going to help address those specific challenges, whether it's congestion, roadway safety, or access to economic opportunity. You know, when you think about roadway safety itself, you know, we've seen a 76% increase in pedestrian fatalities within our region over the last 5 years, and that's not a statistic that anybody should be proud of. And so, just amongst the sort of the way we think about project priorities with our Transportation Policy Board, the relative weight of addressing roadway safety, particularly for pedestrians, has increased, you know, substantially with the last plan update that we did that was adopted in February of last year.
Okay. There was a question that I think worked. So any idea when TDOT? Well, I wanted to add on that there's no coincidence that the FTA has like posted 12 new program analyst positions, given what you were just saying. So do you know when the TDOT will turn the new IIJA funds loose to Nashville MPO TIP or TDOT Small Cities STP fund balances? I mean, do you know that yet? Has that come down?
Well, I mean, to some extent, I mean, the work is already underway to identify projects for this funding, because that work really never stops, right? So,
right. Well, I mean, that's what the regional transportation plan is for. We have projects waiting for money.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so that work really never stops. We're constantly updating our project lists as we complete projects that have been on the books for a while and bring in new projects because of funding availability. I think, though, more emphasis needs to be placed on how to tap into these discretionary programs at the federal level that Steve started talking about a while ago, those value-added grant programs that we have been tapping into as successfully. Because I'll try to not be confusing in what I'm about to say, but you know, I think it's, in terms of the money that we're currently getting, I want to just give you all a sense of how effective it is. And so the $10.5 billion that we've accounted for the next 25 years. Now, that is not including the new funding from this act, and we will update that figure accordingly, and that will get us a few more projects on the plan list, but more importantly, speed some of those 25-year projects up. That $10.5 billion that we've accounted for in the plan that is accessible from that URL, or both of those URLs that are in the chat now, about 65% of that money is going to specific projects. 35% of the money is sort of set aside for spot improvements to roadway safety, as they pop up. You can't really schedule out intersection improvements over a 25-year period, sort of bucket it together and say, we're going to improve intersections at this sort of clip per year for the next 25 years. Same thing with transit vehicles. We've programmed money for transit capital, transit equipment replacement vehicles and as such. But 65% of the money is going to specific projects. Of the money going to specific projects, 75% of our money is going to support Improve Act projects. And so this is a list of projects that was codified in state law with the passage of the Improve Act that raised our gas tax. The thinking being that we infused our TDOT program with additional state funding, fund these projects that have been on sort of this backlog of projects, as it was called at the time. Infuse some state money to these projects, get them through the process quicker because they're not federalized, get this extra money, get these projects that have just been waiting around for money forever off the books. In the early discussions of the Improve Act, it was thought that the list of projects that were referenced to the Improve Act would largely take about 10 years to complete with the gas tax increase. Well, the most recent estimates for how long it's going to take to get those projects complete, if we're only using the state money generated by the Improve Act, is now out to 70 years. And a lot of that is due to just inflation and right-of-way increases. And so
did you say 70?
70 years if we wait on enough additional gas tax money from the Improve Act to do the
without
same,
using the federal money that
exactly. And so as a result, 75% of the federal funds that we've got scheduled to specific projects over the next 25 years are really trying to get those Improve Act projects done sooner than 70 years, right? And so I think that's the important thing here with this act is that the $1 billion over 5 years additional that we're going to get at the state level will help to clear that list sooner so we can get on to the bigger projects, the more transformative projects that we're all sort of waiting for.
So in theory, it's going to help expedite existing projects pipeline.
Yeah, it's going to make the project that we know we should have done 10 years ago that's not scheduled to be implemented for another 15 years because that's when we'll finally have enough money to do it. It's going to allow us to do that project sooner than 15 years. And so that might be the big takeaway for how to think about this bill with respect to the formula money that comes to us that we have discretion over. That's why I say the emphasis really needs to be on ideating applications to the feds for the discretionary money, the things that we know we need to be doing above and beyond. Yeah, exactly. But the competitive money is going to require additional local funds as well. And again, the Transit Alliance to be commended for making sure we all remember we need dedicated funding to transportation. Part of the reason why we need dedicated funding at the local level for transportation is to check that box at the federal level to be competitive for the discretionary grants that require that essentially you have dedicated funding to help implement and then subsequently operate the transit investments that you all want to see happen in Middle Tennessee.
Thanks for that, Michael. I'm gonna kick that over to Steve and let him fill us in on number one, how much skin in the game is typically are we on the hook for or would make us competitive, right? Number two, why is dedicated funding looked upon as a bonus or a value add for these competitive grants?
Yep. Yeah, and I'll focus on the transit side, specifically on FTA's capital investment grant program, which is where you would see the bigger dollars for, say, bus rapid transit or some type of a significant rail project, whether that be on the Star, light rail, or what have you. Anymore, if you look at the FTA, Federal Transit Administration's New Starts report, you will not see any project getting more than 50% federal share in those projects. And if you look at the most recent report, the average is in the 40% range. Some cities and regions are coming in at the 20 to 25% federal share. In order to, one of the evaluation factors, and there are many in competing for these funds, but one of the most significant is, to the point, Jessica, that both you and Michael have made, is, well, what's the local skin in the game? What's the commitment of local money? And how firm is that commitment? And generally, there are two ways to document that. one is we already have cash on hand. So let's say that we use the Small Starts program, for example. Let's assume that we wanted to go after, say, a $300 million bus rapid transit project, and we would be seeking, hypothetically, $100 million of federal support. So there's $200 million of non-federal money needed. The two ways to be successful under that local commitment category is, number one, get that $200 million upfront and set it aside in an irrevocable way. And the other way is to have that long stream payments over time, dedicated funding that says, okay, we don't have $200 million sitting there right now, but over time we can borrow. And that's what most cities are doing. They've got whatever it is, a sales tax or whatever the mechanism is that they're using for dedicated funding, and they're bonding against it to get those projects funded. And then over time, they're paying down that debt with that dedicated funding source. So that's why, even though, and hopefully Michael and I don't think either one of us are trying to come across as, yeah, this thing isn't really so good. It's great. I mean, there's more money into the program, the stability is there, but make no mistake, it does not let local and regional government or citizens off the hook for transportation investments. The people who come in with the best projects, the best plans, and the best local commitment, including financial commitment, are going to be the most successful in being able to tap into the potential of this bill.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. But I want to know a little bit more, if you could just kind of tack on, why is that important to either come with that, theorized $200 million up front, or have that bond against a dedicated stream that is coming? Why is that so important?
I will be blunt, because I think both you and Michael know that has tended to be my history, and probably a lot of folks on the call. We come in with a $300 million project, and it's a good project. Denver comes in with a $300 million project, and it's a good project. They've got their local money identified, one, of $200 million through their dedicated sources, and they have the bonding capacity to pay for it. We don't. You're sitting in Washington, D.C. evaluating these two projects, knowing that local financial commitment is one of the top 5 rating factors. Who do you award that project to? So it's sort of a hypothetical question, but not really. So, and Michael, you might want to soften my response a bit. But
I was just going to say, Michael, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll double down a little bit here, because Denver is a great example. It's not the only example, but it's a great example because what does Denver have that we don't have, Jessica? Local dedicated funding
regional
for transit,
like
right? So
rail.
Yeah, and before they had the rail, they had their convince their voters to approve a sales tax dedicated to public transportation funding projects, not only the cost share and the construction of those projects, but in the continued operation of those projects, which also costs money after you build it. And the feds don't want to help you build something and that goes out of service 5 years later because you didn't have the funding to operate it. But not only does Denver have local dedicated funding, they've got about 3 times, I'll say twice as much. It's between 2 and 3 times as much in local funding as we're getting from the federal program as a region on an annual basis. We get about $250 million a year from federal sources for highway and transit projects across our region. $250 million, it's a lot of money, it does a lot of good. Denver generates off of their penny sales tax for the RTD about $500 million a year alone. That is leveraging not only the formula funds that we've been talking about that they have discretion over from federal sources, but tapping into the big discretionary pots of money at the federal level that's helping them build the large capital projects that are very expensive to do and hard for individual communities to pay for by themselves. And so Denver is an example, but I can tell you, like, just, we do the benchmarking on our peers all the time. On a funding per capita basis, Denver is about 600% more per capita per year than our region. Austin is 234% more per capita per year in our region. Atlanta is 300% more per capita per year in funding for transportation. So, a lot of this is about the federal program. But to leverage the federal program to its fullest extent, you've got to have local skin in the game. And then those two things combined, so leveraging the federal program with local funds is only going to get you part of the way there. You're going to have to also put a lot of just locally funded projects without any federal participation on the books to get everything that people know we need to be doing here in Middle Tennessee.
So just real quick, when you mention transportation funding per capita right now, that means overall transportation funding, right?
Yep, state, local, federal combined levels of funding for transportation within those peer metro areas.
But not just one particular aspect of a transportation system, the whole transportation system.
Yeah, well, yeah, roads and bridges and transit, walking, biking.
The conversation that we're having tends to get interesting because some folks will call transit transportation or in refer to, so I always try to be a little mindful about, okay, when you say transportation, you mean the big system, roads, including roads and transit and those things. But sometimes I try to say transit when I'm talking specifically about public transit, right? So just so folks are.
Yeah, and it's hard to stay clean, so to speak. I mean, even in Denver, the T-Rex corridor, the I-25 corridor, that's like, imagine if we had light rail to Franklin, Brentwood and Franklin here in Middle Tennessee, that would be their equivalent, their south corridor there. That was not really just a transit project. They also widened the interstate and replaced all the overpasses. That was a Colorado DOT and Denver RTD going through the Dr. Cog, which is their NPO process, to come up with a multimodal project. It was pulling money from different pots. Some of it was transit specific money, some of it was highway money. But even like when we start thinking about these large capital projects, they're not likely to be completely contained within a single mode. Anytime we start looking at adding capacity, it's going to be ultimately like a multimodal sort of approach.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And I would even dovetail on that, Jessica, on what Michael's saying on some of the smaller projects. We're doing a lot more projects in terms of specific stop and station upgrades. Where you are looking at sidewalk infrastructure and pedestrian crossings. It's a lot of the work we're doing, certainly in the city of Nashville with NDOT, but even in some of the outlying communities that we operate in and trying to make, that transit service more accessible. So I think Michael's absolutely right. When I think about public transit, I look at it more the service element of it. But the infrastructure is much broader than that, particularly if we look at, an approach, let's say like arterial bus rapid transit or freeway bus rapid transit, where you're really not going to be able to distinguish, well, where does the roadway project end and the transit project begin? Even the, one of the more significant ones we've done recently with NDOT, the transit signal priority project in the Murfreesboro Pike corridor. It's a transit signal priority, but it essentially amounted to a complete replacement of the entire signal system in 40 some intersections.
Just given the situation as it is right now, Steve, are there any immediate projects for either the RTA or MTA side of WeGo that you're looking at pushing for some of these funding opportunities?
Well, first of all, coming back to the formula dollars and what I said earlier, the fact that it actually stabilizes the capital program, we will definitely be better positioned to work with our member cities on the RTA side, certainly on the MTA side with the city of Nashville on some of these spot improvements. So expanding our stop and shelter upgrade program. We saw the city of Nashville, Mayor Cooper this year put significant resources in the city's capital spending plan toward stop and shelter improvements, transit centers, and we would look to leverage those funds with, additional funding out of the federal program. And then as we're moving forward, another element in the city of Nashville's capital spending plan was to help us start advancing planning on the Murfreesboro Pike corridor toward a potential high capacity transit project. So our goal in that process, which will be kicking off in the next few months, is to enter the Federal Transit Administration's project development process for capital investment grants. Again, recognizing that, those criteria like local commitment and a lot of the other emerging, a number of the social equity pieces and the pedestrian safety pieces and the climate change issues are all going to be part of those evaluation factors that they take a look at.
Michael, do you have anything to add to that?
No, not specifically.
Okay. I want to visit some questions we had in the chat. I want to go back to look at those. Recognizing that this could be beyond the conversation today, and I think it is, but it is tangential. How do you determine if these jobs get awarded to contractors from the city where the work is being done? And I think that's part of an RFP process that once the funding is secured, you would go through, right?
Yeah, I think obviously TDOT has their bidding processes, as do we. Typically with the federal funds, there's actually a prohibition against what we'll call local preference hiring, so that you essentially do have to, I'll use construction as an example, where you're typically having to award to, a low bid contractor, no matter, where they might be from. So, there's some capacity, and again, that'll come back to if you have a strong local funding program, you have a little bit more flexibility in that realm. But typically with federal dollars, there are restrictions on those sorts of limitations, but it's an open bidding process. And certainly if there are any contractors, because I know there are consultants on here, I know several of them. In terms of WeGo Public Transit, whether it be MTA or RTA, certainly go to our webpage and there's a procurement portal that will tell you, what procurements are out there now and the ones that are coming up in the near future.
Thanks for that. And then Adam says, speaking of every 5 years, I think that was harkening back to Michael's comment about how this reauthorization, the IIJA was a reauthorization of funds that for road building and funding. The FAST Act used to be called the FAST Act. So is there an update due for Nashville Next? And I don't know about that, but I do know that In Motion is due for an update, right, Steve?
Yeah, we're scheduled probably to kick off the update to the transit. For lack of a better word, we'll call it a transit master plan. Although, as I always say to our folks, that really kind of reeks of 70s Soviet agricultural policy. But updating the transit plan probably toward the end of this year. And I know something that Michael and his staff can relate to. One of the things that we're waiting on to kick that off, number one, is, really robust information coming out of the 2020 census, which will certainly inform that process. Frankly, from a transit and an overall mobility perspective, and I might be overly optimistic in saying the end of this year, we kind of want to see how the post-pandemic commuting and mobility patterns kind of emerge longer term, coming out of that, so that if we're looking at probably a 3 to 5 year planning horizon, that we're actually planning around what's most likely to happen, as opposed to, trying to deal with a specific moment in time.
Okay. I know that, I'm looking at time right now, and I know that we had scheduled an hour and a half, but I got word that I think the invitation for our participants was for just 1 hour. So, and in the interest of time and the participants' time, I think what I'd like to do is to ask you both to give us final thoughts on, and I think you've done first of all, I just want to say thank you so much, because I think you've both done an excellent job of talking to us about the IIJA, the funding, defining what the difference between formulaic funding and the discretionary spending, and being competitive, and why that's important, and why we have to continue to talk about the need for dedicated funding in the region, specifically for transportation and public transit. It will continue to be an issue until we get it in hand, right? So thank you for that. But I want to see if you have any final thoughts, if there's something that we haven't touched on that you think is just, needs to be said about it. Michael, I'm going to let you have first go at that.
Thank you, Jessica. Well, just thank you for your leadership on the transit initiatives and making sure that we don't lose sight of the need for dedicated funding. And you're always a strong advocate for everything that we do at the GNRC to make sure that we're considering improvements to transit and transit accessibility. So thank you for that. As it relates to the Act specifically, I'd offer a couple of key takeaways that I think have been hit on pretty hard already. One, good news, right? We're not going to be waiting around forever on a reauthorization of our transportation law. It's done. It was done in a very timely way. It was done in a way that infused additional money, right? So that is good. And that money comes to us in two different ways: formula funds, which we have complete discretion over with respect to how that money is spent on projects within the parameters of the eligibility. And then there's competitive money that we've got to go after on a national level in DC that we can make our region more competitive at by working together. The other key takeaway here, though, is because I know people are often frustrated about not being connected to the projects in the pipeline. Please do take advantage of the URLs. There's interactive maps, interactive databases that are going to show you all the projects that are in the pipeline that are anticipated to be done with federal funds over the next 25 years. There's an interactive database that's going to show you what projects are being implemented in the next couple of years. So if you're more of a short-term person than a long-term thinker, you can see there's $1.6 billion just in the short term being invested across Middle Tennessee from federal, state, and local sources. That's all accessible at those URLs. So that's another key takeaway: is go learn more about what projects in the pipeline and then form an opinion about it. Either say, this is how we should be spending our money. And if you don't think we should be spending our money that way, we want to know that as well, because we've got to sort of turn this ship towards the direction that you want to go. It really, it's these 5-year cycles that seem like long periods of time in between these plan updates, but it's a continuous process. And so we need to be knowing from you whether or not you think we should be doing something different with our federal dollars here in Middle Tennessee to make sure that by the time we have that next plan ready for adoption by the Transportation Policy Board, that we've done what we can to get it rerouted, so to speak. So those are my takeaways. Can appreciate everybody being on today as well and volunteering your time to be engaged in the conversation.
Thank you, Michael. Steve?
Thank you. I mean, I'll dovetail and I guess echo what Michael said. My main takeaway is that, first of all, thank you to everybody who's participating in this. Sometimes this stuff can be dry as toast, to be sure. Michael and I, among some of the others on the call, happen to be desperately sick enough to actually get into some of this stuff and kind of enjoy it. But don't let up on the push for, local consensus building around specific projects, plans, and funding sources. The more consensus we have and the more support we have, the more successful we'll be when we compete for those funds. And just to give you, coming back to, my comments earlier about those pipelines. Jessica, I know you're well aware, last year, Austin passed a dedicated funding stream with a program of projects that showed very strong support from their electorate. The transit agency in Austin entered 3 projects into project development for new starts. So the longer we wait to do this, and the more we kind of fight about it, the more projects go into that pipeline ahead of us. And again, even with an additional infusion of billions of dollars through this act, the New Start, Small Starts program is still oversubscribed. So it will still be very competitive to get those funds. So that's probably what my main takeaway is. And thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much again. I heard so many things when, the longer we wait, the further behind we're going to get. And we have approximately 5 more years to get some dedicated funding in before they revisit and reauthorize these larger buckets of funding, right? So thanks again. Thank you all for logging in. I think, Todd, you are ready to do a wrap up, and we will, in theory, have this recording ready and share with everyone at a later date after this is done.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Steve and Michael. That was fabulous. I really appreciate you being so generous with your time. Thank you all the panelists for showing up and engaging. Obviously, as the comments that were just shared emphasized, that's really important. Dedicated funding is really important. Stay tuned for more content from the Transit Alliance and from moving forward on that, and get involved. It's important to our quality of life. It's important to the city that we love. And everyone here is really doing what's important, and that is getting educated and informed and then getting involved. So thanks for a great panel. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.